This is another iROAR podcast.
So there's also a big possibility that echolocation may be also used not only for auto communication but for social communication.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. This is season 4, where we're focused in on animals and sound. And you will be forgiven for being a little bit confused because, as you know, normally episode 10 of every season is focused on a grad review. But instead of having a grad review, this episode is looking at back communication. So I ended up in probably what's a really nice and delightful predicament in that I had sent out an invite to one guest, and while waiting, I'd waited for a bit of time and thought that they weren't available. And then I sent out an invite to another guest, and then both guests kind of said yes to me at within 2 days of one another. So instead of turning away someone who had put aside time to talk about animals, I thought, well, why not give you a bonus episode? In the last episode, we spoke about dolphins, and we touched a little bit on echolocation, and we thought about how differently they experience the world. And I think you get a taste of that here in this episode. So instead of focusing on a concept, which is normally what we do in every episode, in this episode, I'm really just focusing in on bat communication. And myself and Gloriana speak throughout the whole episode, just talking about bats. And you can hear that I know nothing about bats, and I'm trying desperately to understand the ways in which they're categorized and the numerous ways in which they experience the world. And I hope that you find it as illuminating as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Gloriana. Gloriana Chaverri is an associate professor at the Golfito campus of the University of Costa Rica. She is also a research associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and her research focuses in on bats. It was first focused on the topic of mating systems and social organization, and both her past and current projects kind of have a broad focus and interest in ecology, behavior, and the conservation of bats. However, her main research interest currently is on bat vocal communication, a topic that she's been developing since 2009 and which we spend a great deal talking about in this episode. We don't only speak about the ways in which bats experience the world through sound, but the numerous ways in which bats communicate. And it's just a really delightful conversation where I learn a great deal, and Gloriana is just so generous and giving. So I hope you enjoy listening. Hi, Gloriana. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast.
Hi, Claudia. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So today we're going to do something slightly different to what the normal episodes are. So normally in an episode, I center a conversation on a specific concept. But today, because the whole season has been looking at sound, I thought it would be really cool to actually center on a specific animal. Now, there have been some animals that have come up in previous episodes, of course. In the previous episode, I spoke to Denise Hertzing, and we spoke about dolphins for a long time. I've spoken to some folks about chickens and some of the sounds they make, and we've definitely spoken about a variety of different animals. But I thought it would be really cool to just maybe speak to you about bats and bat communication today, because I don't know. Honestly, I started reading a little bit about bats, and I realized just how little I knew. So I thought it would just be fun to talk to you. So thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get into the conversation about bats, though, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. So could you maybe tell us who you are, what kind of work you do?
The work that I focus in has always been on bad social behavior, how individuals locate each other, why they stay together, and for example, how big the groups are, how stable they are as well, if individuals are staying all the time together or they're splitting up day after day. And so the topic of social behavior in general is what I was always interested in. But now lately, of course, I've been focusing quite strongly on the topic of communication as it is related to, to this topic of social behavior as well in bats. And so my latest and the work that I do the most is focused on, how bats in particular use vocal communication for these social tasks. And I'm a Costa Rican. I was born in San Jose, the capital, and I came to live in a small town called Golfito, which is in the southwestern part of the country. and it has some of the best areas for studying animals. Some huge protected areas, very pristine, and so the work here is just idyllic, I think. Mm.
Amazing. It sounds, I mean, for the type of work you're doing, it sounds like you're in exactly the right place to be asking the questions you are. I love that you're foregrounding social communication. So, when I spoke to Denise Hertzing, we spoke a lot about, I think, about the natural sciences and kind of how observation works. Was your journey to understanding bats one through kind of ethology and ecology, or did you start in the social sciences and thinking about, bat communication?
I think I mostly started with a stronger ecology background, I think. So, for example, I was always interested in, how the environment affects bats, and more like the typical questions that many of us ask at the beginning has a strong ecological and conservation focus, like which type of habitats are harboring the best quality of, or the best bat communities, and from there, how those differences in those communities or habitats may be affecting, it, social behavior in particular. That's more or less the transition I made. So from being interested in something that's a bit more general, ecology and conservation, then some of the questions pertaining to more, social behavior or animal behavior in general started pouring out after I learned a bit more about the ecology and conservation of bats. So it was more, yeah, I think it was a transition from mainly ecology towards animal behavior, which is something also that I always wanted to do since the beginning.
Fascinating. So you were asking ecological questions, and then in kind of asking ecological questions, did bats then emerge as a really important species or group to understand, or did you kind of start with a really keen interest in bats but asking ecological questions about bats?
I started mostly, yeah, with an interest in bats.
Aha, okay.
Although before I started working with bats, I was interested in mammals and social behavior in general. But then when I started learning about bats, then I had so many basic questions about this large group of mammals that I needed to go to the more basic questions in order to understand some of the others that I was most interested in, like communication and social behavior. But yeah, my interest basically started with bats, and then I moved on to some of the topics that I found most fascinating.
And what sparked this initial interest in bats? What was it about bats that just made you think, wow, I really need to understand and learn more about these mammals in particular?
Well, I think a topic that would come up very often, and this is something that happened to me at the beginning, and that's why I fell in love with bats, is that there's so little known about them. They're a huge group of mammals, very diverse in many many senses, but then there's so little known about them, and a lot of people don't like them. So in a way, it was like this huge group of mammals, very interesting, and a lot of people don't like them. And so it was very fascinating to me why people don't like them, how to understand them better and make people fall in love, as many of us do. That was, I think, a big way uh, to start my work with bats.
I'm happy you said that because obviously, in doing a season on animals and sound, you start to think about the variety of ways that animals experience sound. And, dolphins and bats are kind of, I think, characterized, they often come forward when thinking about sound because they have this kind of unique relationship with sound because of echolocation. But when I came across your paper and I started reading, I was something like I was blown away really because one, I had no idea that the bat group was so huge. Really, like I thought bats were just kind of out there, these small little, and then you start to unpack the variety of ways in which bats communicate. And I think we tend to foreground echolocation as being like, oh, how do bats communicate? They communicate with echolocation, and we've got this really simple story about bats. And I think that's why I really wanted to talk to you today is to just pry apart some of the complexity of how what we know about bats, but also what you think this could tell us about how bats experience the world. So maybe we could start with talking about the size of this group. When you say it's a big group, what are you actually meaning? What does that mean?
Well, for all of this, the mammalian group, which is of course to us an extremely important group of organisms in this planet, um, the the most diverse order of mammals are rodents. So we have
Mhm.
rodents. There's thousands of species, and the second one, which is still also highly diverse, is the order of bats, which is called Chiroptera. And so we're talking about let's say around 1,400, 1,500 species. There's a lot of new species that are being still discovered on a yearly basis,
Wow.
basically. So this is a large group, and it's the only group of mammals that can fly, and so that increases the complexity and how interesting this group of mammals is.
We're going back to, I think, primary school now in thinking, because it's crazy. Like, yes, I'm a PhD candidate, but I tend to take a lot of these kind of categories for granted, right? We speak about species, we speak about orders, and then I realize that the more I look at it, the more I'm like, what defines a species or what defines a mammal? The more I try to define it, the harder it almost somehow, for me at least, seems to be like what constitutes a species. So when you're speaking here about an order, if I understand correctly, and please help me here because I'm not an ecologist, you've got the animals, right? You've got Animalia, and then underneath Animalia, you've got Mammalia, which is the big group that we belong to, and then I think there are other groups like insects and fish uh, and then under that, under Mammalia, we've got orders. So the orders are like the next big category. And now you're saying that rodents are the first, the biggest, and then you've got bats. Which, what was the word you used? You used chlora
Chiroptera.
Chiroptera. It sounds like a dinosaur. Chiroptera. Okay. And then in there you've got bats, and bats are really dynamic and diverse. And then something you mentioned in the paper as well, which I didn't know, is just the size difference in these bats, right? So you've got ones that are about the size of what, a penny, tiny, and then you've got, are they called flying foxes? The really large ones in, is it Australia?
Yeah, there's in Australia, Africa, yep, the old world, old, paleotropics, basically.
So, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about some of these different kind of variances? So, they've got difference in size, but maybe if you could highlight some of the other variances when we think about bats, because we've kind of got a stereotypical idea of bats. So, if I could just give you an opportunity now to kind of maybe bring more color to what our imaginations are with regards to bats.
Definitely, the difference in size is something that's very interesting. The smallest is, let's say, 2, 3 grams. It's something so small. It's called the bumblebee bat. And then the biggest is, I don't know, 1 kilogram, which is huge for a flying organism. And so the wingspan is enormous, and it's so fascinating. And so this is only about size. Let's think about, for example, what they eat. So they can eat, the majority of species are insect eaters. This is such an important resource for the majority of species, especially those that live in areas, temperate regions where fruits are not that common, or flowers, for example. And so insects is the main diet for majority of species. But then we have those that are eating fruits. So the really big ones that we're talking about, the flying foxes, for example, they they also specialize in eating fruits. So they can carry these big mangoes or other fruits that they feed upon. Many other species also have very interesting specializations, like very long snouts, extremely long tongues, so they can use to reach the nectar from flowers, with various forms. And we also have uh, a very interesting group of, which is very diverse. Like it evolved in different groups of bats, which is the ones that feed on fish. So we have the fish eating bats. They have, fascinating specializations or adaptations to be able to fish or, get the fish. So they fly very close to the water, like they're just barely on top of the water, and when they detect a movement with their echolocation, so they stick their feet inside the water, and they have very long toes, and the nails are also very long, and they grab the fish very efficiently from the water.
Wow.
And so there's several species that do this fish eating. There's also the ones that, the carnivorous bats, um, like they hunt, other bats, birds, and including also one really fascinating species that has been studied for a long time, is the frog-eating bat, Trachopsirosus, and they take advantage of the sounds that are emitted by the male frogs when they're, uh, searching for their mates or trying to attract their mates. And so they take advantage of those calls, and they locate them, and they eat them. Um, and then, of course, we have
Wow.
the really famous or infamous, I don't know, the vampire bats, which is a extremely fascinating group of bats that feed exclusively on the blood of birds mostly, but also one species also feeds on the blood of mammals. So this is also an extremely interesting specialization, which just shows some of the diversity of, that has can be found in bats.
That's incredible.
Like, okay, so we have the differences in sizes, differences in diet, but we also have differences in shapes and forms in the face or the rostrum, structures that allow them to amazing more efficiently, or these weird shapes that we really don't understand well, what they can be used for. And the diversity of colors, there's some that are orange, some are completely black, and we have the white ones. Oh no, it's I could talk for hours and hours about the diversity of. Mean, this is only the things that you can see, and very easy. But then, the diversity in communication, in social behavior, it's enormous.
I can hear your passion. It's just coming through. And I mean, just in off the top of your head, you've rattled off more about bats than I ever knew. Uh, in terms of geography, so there's in my rudimentary understanding, I'm assuming that these differences emerge from different environments, right? Because they've been in relationship with different environments and different species. So, like you spoke about the frog there, using sound to, I mean, the bat using the frog sound as an effective way to both hunt but also to interact with the world. So I'm guessing here, based on just the diversity of bats that you're speaking of, we also find bats in numerous places.
Bats are the mammals that have the widest distribution in the world. So, for example, in many islands, there are no native mammals except for bats. Yeah, definitely, their distribution it's worldwide. It's the most widely
Wow.
distributed group of mammals. So,
Okay. I suppose
yeah,
it makes
their
sense because they
capacity
can
to
fly.
fly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Wow. And I mean, it's fascinating because I think for me at least, they've so often been invisible. I don't see bats. They're not really so yes, I grew up in South Africa and I was exposed to a variety of different mammals, and then coming to North America where there's a very different kind of experience with mammals, like urban animals like squirrels and stuff I didn't see in Johannesburg. But bats, I know that they're there, but I rarely ever see them. Maybe at dusk in all of these places, I'll sometimes see what seems to be a movement in the sky, but they don't kind of demand attention in the way that other animals do that we live with. So is that are all bats nocturnal? Is that why we don't really see or recognize them?
I well, I think it's the majority of species are nocturnal. There are some that are diurnal, but definitely the wide majority. For example, all the ones that we have in America, the continent is they're all nocturnal. I've seen some species, definitely they're active during the day. The ones that I've been able to see, like in other parts of the world, but definitely the majority of nocturnal. So that really plays a big role in on our understanding and appreciation of bats. I think it's just the fact that they're so mysterious, according to a lot of people. We don't know what they're doing, and they only come out at night, and they're also dull colored, and I don't know. It's just it casts like this mysterious aura around bats that I think
Yeah.
has created a more negative impression of them.
And I think it's also there is this interesting relationship between visibility and animals that we take seriously. So when I spoke to Jonathan Belcom about fish, for example, he said one of the reasons why he thinks fish are so overused and why the welfare of fish is not necessarily taken seriously is because they're in a different medium to us. We don't see them kind of in the way, so they're not even of the same order as us. So kind of finding empathy for beings that are in a completely different world is really hard. And I think to some extent it's like that with bats, but instead of the water being kind of the separation, it's our rhythms, it's our daylight versus nighttime. And I think that that's really interesting to think through. That we're living with animals that are all around us that we don't see, but that's not a reason to
Yeah,
vilify them.
that's true. Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, the fact that we cannot see them, or we never interact with them, also doesn't create this empathy that I think people have towards birds or other mammals. I don't know, squirrels or monkeys that you can see during the day. So that's an excellent point, definitely.
So maybe we could switch now to talking a bit about the communication aspect, which is your passion. So we've spoken a lot, I think, about the physiology and stuff, but something that I've kind of in starting this podcast that I've been learning now increasingly is that animals communicate in such diverse ways. Learning that whales have different dialects and some whales don't necessarily understand what other whales are saying, or chickens have a variety of words and ways of communicating with the world. And I had no idea. So, could you tell us about how bats communicate and maybe which bats you're focusing on here and some of the ways in which they communicate?
Um, just to begin, I think it's really important that, for animals in general, but bats in particular, we have so little information about how they really communicate. So the information is growing and growing steadily throughout the years. So, but there's still so many things that we don't understand quite well about them. We know that olfaction, smell, is really important for bats. That they may be using some odors to communicate certain aspects of their lives, whether they're like in many other mammals, whether they're in estrus, for example, if females are already available for copulating, or they can start mating. They also have many different glands that they emit these interesting odors. We also don't know a lot about them, but still there's a few groups that are working on this issue quite a lot. So I think that's also very interesting, and there's a lot of room for growth here. Another topic that I think is fascinating and no one has really done much about it is like visual communication. Are bats really using some of their markings or postures or something to communicate with other individuals? Even though they're nocturnal, they're sometimes when they're at their roost, they're resting during the day. They're still visible to each other. So we still don't know if they may be able to communicate visually, for example. And definitely one of the main form in which, or at least that we have been studying, is vocal communication. So we know that bats, a lot of the species are nocturnal, so visual communication is very complicated, and it'll also move in very wide areas. So of course, olfaction and smells might not be really useful in when they use in such large areas. So acoustic communication definitely is the way that we think may be most important for bats for communication. So you're right in saying that the the majority of people has focused on what's called this auto communication, which is echolocation. So they're producing sounds with the aim of those sounds returning some information, uh, about their environment, the availability of resources. So it is an important way in which they auto communicate. Um, but and there's also some evidence that other individuals may be using these echolocation sounds to gather information about the individual that's emitting the echolocation. So there's also a big possibility that echolocation may be also used not only for auto communication but for social communication. So, for example, they may distinguish between males and females, or individuals that are familiar or non-familiar, and even they may be also perceiving the using the information that's emitted through echolocation to, for example, understand if there's a huge availability of resources in an area, because they can hear all the other bats that are echolocating, and they're uh, giving out this information that there's, for example, food that's available in a specific area. And so I think in general, echolocation has a lot of potential for social communication. But then, of course, there are so many specific calls that are used for social communication specifically. And this is the area that I've been focusing mostly on. Like with many other species of birds and mammals, we know that bats emit many different calls in different contexts. And, and we know that for some species there may also be dialects. So, one population may differ in the way they emit a specific call from another population far away. But there's still so much to learn. For the majority of species, we have no idea which calls they're producing. The context in which they're producing them is so difficult to understand, because we need to see which individual is producing the call, what they're doing in that specific moment, and when that individual produces a call, what reaction do the other individuals have? We really don't know that well. Again, this is a topic that's developing quite a lot.
And I guess what makes that quite hard is, one, you're dealing with, because your work is primarily, if I understand, your work is primarily in the field. You go and you watch bats, and I'm assuming doing that at nighttime is hard. But also, bats tend to roost in fairly large populations. So I think we've got a bit of a bias, maybe as researchers, when it comes to understanding animals, to choose to understand, and mammals in particular. We tend to think of herds as like single blocks. Like if you're looking at a herd of gazelle or wildebeest or something, I think we really struggle to view them as individuals, to say, oh, there's one buck amongst all of those buck who's experiencing the world in a particular way. Yet when we encounter maybe some mountain gorillas, they're a population, but they're a much smaller population. And I think this speaks to some of the ways and challenges of how we know, right? Like it's easier to, I think, look at a group of individuals, gorillas, and start to discern their relationships. But because it's so hard to understand how these big groups relate to one another, um, we tend to just treat them as this single group that don't have any sort of individual significance. Are you finding that in understanding this communication, that you're starting to see some social dynamics, like, I don't know, friendship or preferences for who bats hang out with? Are you seeing those kinds of variances?
Yeah, definitely. And not only my studies, but there are several studies that have shown that, like, individuals are, they prefer to hang out with other, or specific group members, for example. That's definitely the case. And in although many species we tend to think of them living in these huge groups, for example the ones that are in caves, the interesting thing is they still show preferences for roosting or being very close to specific individuals. So that's sort of like the first clue. But also often when they move from one roost to the other, they also prefer to move with other individuals. And this is in the case of species that are living in, these large roosts or these sites that allow the aggregation of many different individuals. But in the case of the species that I work with, the species disc-winged bat, they live in very small groups. So there's like, an average of 5 individuals. So, and the interesting thing about this species is that they also, when they move together. So their friendship is really, really strong. And this is, one of those few species that have this really strong connection with their other group members, and this connection may last for several years. So this is also something important to consider.
So it's like a pack. It's like how we would think of wolves
Yeah,
as a pack that have social reliance on one another. Do you find that in looking at a smaller group like this, do you find that like different bats are helping other bats care for their young and help, like, is there that kind of um because I think it does make it easier to kind of look at the smaller group and kind of understand that. So what kind of social relationships have you started to identify from this close knit relationship?
there is definitely, moms are taking care of their pups, and we're seeing it's still very preliminary because we haven't been able to track individuals for a very long time until now. But we are definitely seeing this. The strongest association typically is the mother with the pup. And so even in some cases when the group gets very large, it seems like the mom is dispersing, it's going away from the group, separating from the group. And when she does that, she often takes her, what we call the young of the year. So the individual that was born that year and it's already flying, it seems like the mother, because the mom needs to get away from that group, which is already very large, but she's doing it with her pup. So that's definitely a very important and very interesting phenomenon that we're trying to understand a bit better. But then in the whole interactions, for example, within the roost and when they're foraging, we still don't understand them that well, which individuals are showing preference towards each other. And this is something that we're trying to address in a communication sense with the project that we have right now. And we're trying to see, for example, when individuals are engaging in this communication or this exchange of sounds, which is very important for the species that I study, um, we're trying to see if individuals are responding preferentially to others that are highly genetically related to them, or if they prefer to answer to individuals that they know very well, that they're very familiar with. So we think there are preferences in these interactions between individuals, but at least for the species that I work with, we don't know that very well. And in other species, this is something that's not highly studied.
How do you do this in the field? So you spoke about some of the challenges. Like, what does a day for you look like actually in the field? How does this all play out? How do you learn this stuff?
This is interesting because you also mentioned that, working at night and all that, but we actually work during the day. So all these interactions, these vocal interactions that I've been telling you about, also happen very very often during the day. The species that I work with, they use this very ephemeral resource. The roost that they use is like when the leaves of plants such as heliconias, when they start developing, they form this tube, and so the bats go into that tube and they spend their day there. but sometimes they get scared because there's an animal that hits the tube or the leaf opens up, and so they have to find a new place to roost very quickly. And so this happens during the day, and if it happens during the day, they're in a big hurry to find a new roost because they may be eaten by diurnal predators. And so they hurry a lot to find this new roost. And when they're doing that, they're communicating with each other and coordinating with each other so they can find the roost together. So for us, a normal work day would look like we go out, we search for these tubular leaves that are developing, and if one of these tubes has a group of bats, then we'll capture them very carefully, put them in a bag all together, the group together, and then we'll bring them to the lab or to our flight cage. Also, we have this portable flight cage, and we bring them there, and we start doing whatever experiment we're trying out that day. So we work with the bats a little bit. We take very good care of them. We never let them fly for more than 5 minutes. We always feed them at the end of the experiments. And then when we're done for the day, we just go out again to the field and put them back in the roost where we found them. So that's our typical day.
Do the bats find this stressful? Do you get the sense that they find this whole experience quite stressful?
When they haven't done it, they seem more stressed. Like they vocalize very often, and they seem just angry and distressed. And so we take good care because of course, this process of being angry and vocalizing that they takes a lot of energy from them. So that's why we need to feed them and provide water and everything just to make sure that they're healthy when we return them. But the ones that we have been, I'm pretty sure we have recaptured some individuals, maybe hundreds of times, and so they seem very calm. We bring them to the lab. It seems like they're ready to do their thing, and then at the end they're very anxious to get their mealworms, their food at the end. And no, they do pretty well. And we haven't had like deaths or anything that's very often related to stress. So I think they cope well.
Why do you think? I mean, I guess we could start any sort of research from saying that there's been something of an animal turn, I think, and an appreciation that animals do communicate and they do have culture, uh, and I think in general there's a shift towards starting there, appreciating that, and saying that yes, let's start with that as an assumption. Um, so why then, if we're starting from that baseline, why then does it become important to still do these kinds of studies with understanding back communication? What's the I guess, like, what's the end goal? What's the point? Why is this knowledge important? Is it just so that we know, or is there more to it?
I think there's definitely more to it. I mean, not only are we doing a lot of these studies just for curiosity, right? I think this is just a scientific endeavor
Hmm.
in general. But then also, uh, for example, in many other species, many other organisms, we know that individuals need to communicate for finding mates or for providing sustenance to their young, which obviously are very important fitness related activities. And when they cannot communicate properly, then they may not be able to find mates, they may not be able to provide or find their pups, for example. And so, understanding when they communicate, how they communicate, may allow us to also understand how we humans are affecting this process of communication. For example, we know that we're producing a lot of sounds that are masking or even causing stress to animals. And so, because we're doing this, they may need to change some of the sounds that they're producing, or they may not be able to find each other. So I think it's important, definitely, for a lot of conservation related issues, that we need to understand not only communication but many other social behaviors as well.
I'm happy you brought us back to sound there, because earlier on when you were speaking about echolocation, I think you're right. I think bats, unlike many of the other species I've spoken about in the season so far, most people say, oh, we don't really know how they experience the world in terms of sound. We've tended to privilege, I think, the visual, but with bats, we've privileged sound. But still, I find echolocation and this idea that you're seeing the world through sound remarkable. Like, I just think it's absolutely, because I struggle to think about what that must be like. I think that's my inclination, is I try to imagine what it would be like to see the world through sound, which is just a remarkable thing to think of. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but just in terms of thinking of sound, and you were speaking, so there's echolocation, which you've spoken about, and then there is uh, these inquiry and response calls, which you said happen in the roost, and that you're figuring out what the social communication is. So in general, we've tended to think of echolocation as a hunting device, but your work is starting to say, well, hang on, more social work might be going on there than just hunting. Um, I know you gave me an inquiry and response clip to play. Could you tell us what's going on here, and then I can maybe play it for the listeners?
Sure. So for the species that I have been working with, this queen bat, when they're in the process of trying to locate a new roost, so they're flying more or less like a group, and one of the individuals finds a place to settle down, a new roost. And so when the individuals are flying, they're staying together, and we think that they're using these inquiry calls very often just to know where each one of them are. And then one of them finds a roost, and if the one inside hears one of these inquiry calls, and it will start producing the response calls. So they start vocalizing and vocalizing with these response calls, and then the rest of the group knows where to find that other individual that already found a new place to be, and so they enter the roost very quickly. So it's like I know there's this game called Marco Polo, and it's
Yeah.
this game where there's people in the swimming pool, and one of them closes the eyes and starts saying Marco, and the other respond Polo, and so this is the way to find each other. That's more or less what the bats are doing.
And there's a different call happening when one of them has found an appropriate roost.
Yeah, when they find an appropriate roost, that's when they start producing the response calls. But they only produce the response once they hear an inquiry call from the ones that are flying. So it's important this that they never respond if they don't have the inquiry call from the ones that are flying around.
So just so that I understand correctly, you've got these leaves that are shaped like bulbs, and inside each of these leaves, you have small groups of individuals. And now, is it that there are in this specific area, there are numerous or several sets of bats in different leaves, and one set of leaves gets disrupted by an animal, and that small group disperses, and they send out inquiries saying, hey guys, we need a place to stay, we need a place to stay. And someone else in another leaf says, come here, you can stay with us. Is that what's going on?
More or less. So the interesting thing is that they basically never or very rarely will join another group. So each one of these small groups, they have more or less their territories. So they have an area that they normally use and where they can find these tubular leaves, right? And so if they get disturbed, the entire group will start flying more or less together, but one individual within that group will find a new place. I don't know, maybe there's some more exploratory, or it just knows better what it's doing. And then whoop, this individual will go very quickly in that leaf, and then the rest will follow once it starts producing the response calls.
Okay.
So this is what's interesting, and it's It's one of the ideas we've developed.
So it's like going on a treasure hunt, and we're all looking for a treasure, and we're saying, "Can you see it? No. Can you see it? No." And then eventually someone sees it, and they're like, "I found it!" And everyone hops in the same leaf. Okay, all right. I'm going to play the calls now quickly. So this is the inquiry. So this is them. This they've been disturbed, and this is them. You said checking in with one another and saying like, "Okay." So so is that one bat releasing one
Yep,
call?
exactly. And just to clarify, so the what I did is, because the calls are very high frequency, this is something that's very important to understand about vocal communication in bats. The majority of the calls that bats are emitting, whether they are echolocation for this auto communication, or if it's social communication, in most cases the calls are not audible to us. They're ultrasound, very high frequencies. So for this inquiry code that you played, what I did is I modified the recording. So I made it a little bit longer so you can hear it better in terms of time, but also I lowered the frequency so we can actually perceive the call, because the normal frequency is not audible to all of us.
Wow. I think that speaks a bit to what we were talking about earlier with regards to how difficult it is to access or think about bats because they're at nighttime and we can't see them and we privilege sight. But even if we were listening, we wouldn't necessarily hear them. They're stealthy in a way that's really which is probably what makes them really effective hunters and at navigating the world. So brought you've brought this down and you've elongated it so that, and I think that's just so fascinating. So you've taken an experience of another animal, which Nagel very famously said, we will never know what it is like to be a bat. But here we're starting to see how technology is making some of those kinds of possibilities or ideas of thinking about what it must be like to be a bat. Because I hear the sound, it actually makes me think of a gibbon, interestingly. That kind of like, it's fascinating. Okay, I'll play the inquiry now and I'll play the response once more. And then the response. So now they've found a leaf and they're going to settle again.
Yes, exactly. So now that after the response, like this really long, that that's the very strong impulse to go into the leaf. So yeah, very effective.
Incredible. Incredible. And you're saying that there might even be some dialects and different ways in which this inquiry response is happening, not only across species, but across different populations within species.
Um, yes, although these calls that I showed you, they're only emitted by this species. So far, this call and response system has only been found in the species that I work with, this queen bat. We know that in other species there may be calls that they're using to locate each other when they're searching or entering a roost site, but we really don't know that much. And at least this, like I said, call and response system hasn't been found in any other species of bat. So, and there is some evidence that there, for this particular system, there may be dialects, like populations far away, they're still using these inquiry response calls within the species, but the calls differ quite a bit between regions, even, for example, within Costa Rica. So there may be something interesting there in terms of dialects, but
Incredible.
we still need to work a little bit more on that.
Yeah, language, culture. It's fascinating. Thank you so much. I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I wanted to ask you so many more questions about actually I even wanted to ask you a bit about biosecurity and how we can better look after bats. So maybe you can give us a hint at what we can do to be good neighbors to bats, and then possibly tell us a bit more about what you're working on now. And oh no, if you have a quote, I almost forgot. Do you have a quote? I'm I'm going to backtrack. I'm asking too many questions. The first question: if we want to be good bat neighbors, what could we do to be better bat neighbors?
there are different things that you can do. Definitely don't, for example, because of the majority of species are insect eaters. I think, for example, not using pesticides to control, I don't know, simple pests, even in your backyard, or if you have a farm, try not to use pesticides as much as possible. And then, what I tell people here in Costa Rica, because we also have a lot of pollinators and fruit eaters, that it's very possible that they don't have enough resources because we have taken away the trees or other flowers that they may use. So if you can plant flowering or fruiting trees that bats like in the area where you live, then that really makes a big difference. The other important thing is that you need to consider that one very, very critical resource for bats are their roosts, the place where they spend their day. So if you know of any bad roosts, just try to take care of them. Don't destroy them. That's very critical for their survival as well. And another simple thing, which might also not only help bats but also a lot of other organisms, is to turn off the lights during the night. I think it's just the lights are not something normal in animals' environment. So if you can try to turn off the light, I think that's also always wise advice.
I think those sound really practical and doable for many of us. Is plant some more flowers and fruit if it's possible. I mean, I think berries are really easy to just put out on a windowsill and not for us, but for others. Let's give back to bats a bit and switch off our lights a bit more. I think those are both doable. And as we've learned today, there are a variety of different bats. So maybe doing a spot of homework on who your local bats are, guarantee there are organizations, because we think of birds and bees as being these really big pollinators, but bats are also just, I mean, we shouldn't only protect them because they pollinate. We should protect them because they're awesome and wonderful and they deserve to be in this world. But they are also doing really important things in the world, and if we can enable that, then we should. So, thank you. Um, okay, so quote time. Quote time. Now,
All right.
what's your quote on?
This is I One of the books that I really, really love is A Short History of Nearly Everything from Bill Bryson.
I
And
love Bill
he
Bryson.
has, yes, and so he has lots of very interesting quotes. So he's quoting himself, Martin Rees, which is a British astronomer. And I really like this because I think it shows a lot of the lack of information that we still have about a lot of topics, and that's in particular. So he says, our present satisfaction with our state of understanding may reflect the paucity of the data rather than the excellence of the theory. So I think it just
Wow.
shows, yeah, we're happy with what we know, for example, in this case about bats, but it's just that there's so much more to learn, that we really need to keep delving very deeply into all of these topics so we can be better at providing information that's going to be ever increasingly more useful for protecting bats and learning how to love this group of mammals much better. So,
Mm. And I think that quote also so beautifully shows kind of we often think of the natural sciences and the social sciences as being kind of separate from one another. But I think that, for me at least, that quote shows how important it is that we have both of these happening at the same time, that we have social scientists and philosophers that are willing to ask these, what seem to many scientists to be esoteric questions about how do animals experience the world? What is the importance of this experience? Just because we don't experience sound in that way, does it make it less important or significant? We need those critical scholars and those philosophers to ask those questions and imagine those things. While at the same time, we also need uh, natural scientists who are going into the field and getting their boots dirty and spending time with the bats and learning about them that way. And we're not always, I think, symbiotic as physical scientists and social scientists. Sometimes we're at loggerheads with one another, and I think, I don't know, it's there's beauty in realizing that we're both kind of working towards the same goals of looking after these really beautiful species, and I think that we both bring important stuff to the table in terms of that. So I really love that quote a lot. Okay, so we're nearing the end of the show now. If folks are interested in learning more about your work, and yeah, they just want to learn more about bats or more about your work, where could they learn and find out more?
I have a webpage that it's www.batscr, like bats in Costa Rica, more or less, .com. And I also have a Twitter account, Morseglu. Yeah, and I have a ResearchGate page also if they're interested in looking at my publications more up to date.
Wonderful. I'll make sure that all of that is in the show notes. Thank you for the work you're doing and in helping us learn more about this really large order.
Thank you, Claudia.
Hi, everyone. So Hannah's not going to be joining us for an animal highlight today, and that's because this whole episode has in effect been an animal highlight. But Cheryl Tipp, who you might remember was a guest earlier on in the season, had sent me two really cool recordings of bat and bat sounds. So I figured, why not share them with you here? If you don't recall, Cheryl Tipp is the British Library's curator of wildlife and environmental sounds, and she's been sending me a couple of really cool sound clips throughout the season that you've been hearing, and I think they've added a great deal to the show. Anyhow, the two recordings that you're going to be hearing today were both made by Richard Ranft, who was a zoologist by training and worked at the British Library Sound Archive for 25 years, and he curated over 150,000 recordings of animals. The first is the echolocation calls of a common pipistrelle hunting over a lake in Kent, England. It was recorded in May 1988 at 50 kilohertz. Here it is.
Common pipistrelle.
Isn't that just an incredible sound? There's something just really magical about just hearing the sound and thinking about that. And for me, it's such a foreign sound and trying to locate and think about it. Really amazing. The second sound, or the second recording that you're going to hear, is echolocations of a noctule bat feeding over grass fields, also in Kent, England. This one was done in June 1986 at 22 kilohertz.
Noctule.
All right. So that's it. I just wanted to share with you two really cool sound recordings. So in this episode and with these sound recordings, you've kind of gotten a sense of the variety of sounds that bats make and how different echolocation can sound and how important it is that we record these, but also how awe-inspiring, I think, and incredible the sounds are just in and of themselves to just hear them. I think it's really mind-boggling. I think these sounds are just incredible, and I've terribly enjoyed kind of finding them and learning a bit about animal sounds. But that's all I wanted to share with you for now. So thank you so much. As always, a huge thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics Apple for sponsoring this podcast. And another thank you to the Sonic Arts Studio and S4EB Lab, which is also known as the Sonic Arts of Place Laboratory, for sponsoring this season. Make sure you join us for the next episode, which will be the last of the season. Yay! And it's going to be a grad review where we're going to stitch together a whole bunch of the different tensions and opportunities that we've learned throughout this season. It's been a rather elongated season. It's been quite spread out. So I think the grad review will be a really neat and cool opportunity to bring all of these themes and threads together. So I hope you join us then. This is The Animal Tone with me, Claudia Hurtenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.